The Glob, story by John O'Reilly, and pictures by Walt Kelly. First Eon. Long ago there was a glob. He was a shapeless thing, and he floated to and fro in the tide of the early sea. When he drifted to, he looked like this. And when he drifted fro, he looked like this. The glob was very sad because he had no feet at all. He floated in the early sea, and he looked with longing eyes toward the land. He thought it would be wonderful if he could romp in the green grass under the tree that grew near the shore. But there was always that same trouble, no feet. It is impossible to romp without feet. So he just drifted and watched the green grass that grew under the tree, the poor glob. His longing for a good romp became so great that one day he decided to do something about it. He thought he had better pull himself together. Fumbling and floundering, but working hard, he arranged himself in the general shape of legs and feet. It wasn't such a good job. The legs were wobbly, and because he had completely forgotten to make himself some knees, they bent in every direction. But the glob was so eager for a romp that he decided to try them out. Slowly he rose up, and he stood there trembling in the shallow water. It was a great experience. But what happened? A wave came along and knocked him down again, flat on his face. The poor glob. But the glob would not give up. For 1,000,000 years he kept trying to get to the shore. He flopped and he floundered, but he kept at it. Gradually his legs grew stronger from so much exercise. One day, tripping and shaking, he found himself out on the land. He was so excited that he sat down on a round stone. The stone was only 1 foot from the edge of the early sea. The glob had made it. Sitting on his stone, he heaved a deep sigh. It was the world's first sigh, and somehow it made him feel a little better. The glob was so tired after his long struggle to get out of the early sea that he just sat on his stone for about 500,000 years. He sat there looking at the wonderful world about him. He looked at the sky and at the clouds, and he felt the warm sunshine. As he sat looking and looking, he wiggled the ends of his feet. It wasn't a very active life, but it was better than just drifting. Then, one day, he happened to look down at his feet, and he got a big surprise. He had wiggled the ends of them for so long that they had divided into 5 stubby sections. The glob puzzled over this for a long time. He was looking at the first toes. He wiggled them some more, and it felt good. When the glob tried once more to walk toward the tree, he found that his new toes helped him to keep his balance. He walked in a crooked line, and he fell down several times, but each time he got up again and pushed on. When he got out of the sand of the seashore and into the firm earth, the going was much better. He didn't wobble as much as he had in the sand. In time, he was walking in the grass. He liked the way it bent under his feet and made a soft cushion. It felt so good that once in a while he would just stand still, resting and looking down at the green grass around his feet. But the bright sunshine in his first walk had made him feel hot, and not far ahead he could see the shade under the tree. So he kept on toward his goal. It took him a long time, but finally he passed into the cool shade beneath the tree. He walked a little further and looked closely at its spreading branches, but he was so tired from all the work of walking from sea to tree that he sat down in the grass and he leaned back against the trunk. As he sat there, a deep feeling of having done something important came over him. It had taken him millions of years to reach the tree, but here he was at last. Leaning his head back against the bark of the tree, he did something very strange. The corners of his mouth spread out a little, and some wrinkles formed at each side. He didn't do it on purpose. It was a good feeling that came from inside of him, and when it reached his face, it made his mouth spread wide. It was the first smile. After smiling his smile, he gazed out at the landscape beyond his tree. There were other trees. Some were huge with enormous leaves. Some were like ferns, but hundreds of times as big as a fern. In the distance he could see a swamp with all sorts of water plants growing in it. Far away he could see some objects moving, but he couldn't make out what they were. As he looked out over the scene, he decided it was a strange world after all. That decision has been reached many times since, but the Glob decided it for the very first time. Suddenly he sat up straight. He had completely forgotten his romp. Here he had spent millions of years reaching the green grass under the tree, and the reason for the trip had slipped his mind. He stood up, walked a couple of steps, and then leaped into the air. When he hit the ground, he leaped again. Soon he was skipping and jumping and running around and around his tree. It was so much fun that he kept on and on. The sun was setting before the Glob stopped, and he stopped then only because he was tired. Once more he sat down and leaned against his tree. His head rolled to one side. His eyes closed, and he went to sleep. As he slept, it seemed that there was a faint smile on his face. It had been a great day. The world's first romp had been accomplished. Second Eon. The days that followed were happy ones for the Glob. He romped in the grass under his tree until he got tired, and then he would rest a while and romp some more. He was romping through life, but there came a day when he discovered that it wasn't any fun to do nothing but romp all the time. One afternoon, as he sat in the shade, he glanced up into the tree. There were branches up there. They reached out in every direction, and the leaves made a sort of tent over the whole tree. He thought if he could climb around on those branches it would be more fun than just romping, but he had no arms. It is impossible to climb without arms. The Glob grew sad again, but being a determined Glob, he tried to climb the tree anyway. He tried so many times to wrap himself around the lowest branch that he began to grow arms, and when he had tried for tens of thousands of years to wrap the ends of his arms around the branch, he found he had developed fingers, just as he had grown toes back on the edge of the early sea. With the aid of his new arms and fingers, he hoisted himself up onto the lowest branch. Once he fell out, and he hit the ground with a dull thud, but he climbed right back into the tree again. After a lot of practice, he was able to swing on the branches and leap about in his tree. This was better than just romping all the time. The Glob felt he was getting up in the world. Each evening as the sun was setting and long shadows reached across the world, the Glob would climb down, curl up in the grass, and go to sleep. But when the dawn came, he would climb back into the tree. This was a fine life, but it seems that the Glob was never satisfied. He wearied of all those ups and downs. There seemed to be no way of solving this problem until he noticed that high up in the tree there was a nice fork formed by 3 strong branches. He broke off some small branches and arranged them in the crotch of the tree. When he had made a sort of platform of them, he pulled some of the big leaves and put them on top of the branches. He got more and more leaves until his construction job looked like a big nest. When it was finished, he got into it and sat down. He jumped right up again, for he had sat down on a sharp branch. He moved the branch and adjusted the leaves. Now and again he would try it and then make more adjustments. Finally, he had it just right. Then he climbed into it and stretched out in a comfortable position. The Glob had never seen anything so wonderful. The big leaves of the tree formed a roof, and when he pulled some more leaves over him, they made a blanket. The Glob stretched out in perfect luxury. Letting one foot hang over the edge, he smiled one of his smiles. This time it was a satisfied smile. He had no way of knowing it, but the Glob was at home. It was the first home. Having made himself at home in the tree, the Glob decided he would do some exploring. He wanted to learn about the strange world. If he was going to explore, he thought he had better get an early start. One morning, just as the sun was rising above the landscape, he climbed down the tree and set out. He was astounded to find so much grass and so many trees. They were everywhere. He stopped often to examine the different kinds of trees and smaller plants. Up to this time, the Glob had nibbled the leaves that grew on the home tree, or had eaten some of the fruit that hung there in clusters. Now he found that some of the other plants had better leaves for eating purposes, and some of the fruit on them was delicious. He ate some every time he stopped, until he was quite round in the middle. This is more like it, he thought. He didn't know what he meant by it. It was just his way of thinking that it was mighty good. Once he was picking some soft, round fruit from some bushes, when from behind him came a terrific roar. It was the loudest sound the Glob had ever heard. He looked up and he saw a huge dinosaur towering over him. The dinosaur had risen up on its hind legs. It had wicked claws on its front feet. Its eyes were cold and cruel. Its enormous mouth was full of long, pointed teeth. The Glob was terrified. Dropping his fruit, he ran as fast as he could. This wasn't very fast, because his middle was so round and full of food. He ran through some bushes and then sped for home. He climbed the tree in record time and sat on a limb beside his nest. As he sat there, he trembled all over. He had never trembled before. He tried to stop, but he couldn't. There was a breeze blowing, and he noticed that the leaves near him were being shaken by the breeze. "Why," he thought, "I'm shaking like a leaf." He crawled into the nest, and he pulled some leaves over his head. But it was a long time before he stopped shaking. The sun was halfway up in the sky the next morning before the Glob awakened. He felt terrible. He had a giddy feeling in his head, and he was perspiring. He also had a severe pain. Finally, he located the pain. He found it was in his middle, where he had put all the different kinds of fruit and leaves. For a long time he sat there in deep thought. He studied his aching middle, and his brow wrinkled in concentration. At last his face lit up. "It must have been something I ate," he thought. "I must be more careful next time." He felt too miserable to do any more exploring or even tree climbing, so he just pulled the leaves over him and curled up around his aching middle. The poor thing was suffering from the first stomach ache. Third Eon. Even though he had suffered an awful fright, the Glob still yearned to find out more about the strange world. He made more and more trips away from his home tree, but now he was careful. He kept his eye peeled for dinosaurs, or anything else that might get after him. He became a cautious Glob. He learned that there were many kinds of dinosaurs. There were fierce ones with big teeth and claws which were dangerous. There were others which were tremendous, but they just wallowed in the swamps and ate water plants. When the Glob walked along the edge of the swamp, they raised their heads and stared at him curiously, but then they resumed their eating. They seemed to be eating all the time, and their middles were very large and round. They must have awful pains in their middles, the Glob thought. On the land he found there were many kinds of small animals. He thought it would be nice to play with some of them, but when he drew near them, they ran away. Sometimes he would chase one, but it always ran into the woods and thickets and escaped. Often he would sit watching them from a distance, studying the way they ate, the way they walked, and the way the young ones played. Without knowing it, the Glob became the first student of nature. He was an observing Glob, and each day he learned something new. In time he learned to divide the dinosaurs into two groups, the friendly dinosaurs and the mean dinosaurs. He wondered why some should be bad and some should be good, but he never grew tired of watching them. Late one day he was on his way back to the home tree. By this time the Glob had realized that it was good to have a place to come home to, and he returned to his nest every night. This evening he was walking along a trail which the animals had made. It was easier walking, and it led in the general direction of his tree. Glancing ahead, he saw a medium-sized dinosaur cross the trail ahead of him. The Glob had had a good day and was feeling mellow. As he watched the creature ahead of him, he thought, "Why does the dinosaur cross the trail?" And then he thought, "To get to the other side." To the Glob, there seemed to be something funny about these thoughts, so he tried it again. "Why does the dinosaur cross the trail?" he thought. "To get to the other side," he answered in his thoughts. It struck him so funny that he began to laugh. He laughed and he laughed and he laughed. Then he thought the whole business over again, and he rolled on the ground and he laughed some more. On the way home he would stop now and then, think over the business about the dinosaur crossing the trail, and each time he would laugh some more. The poor Glob had no way of knowing it, but he had made the first joke. Also, the Glob had laughed the first laugh, because up to that time he had only smiled. This was very important, because before that day it had been a grim world with no laughter in it. That night, as the Glob curled up in his nest, he thought over his joke once more. Then he laughed himself to sleep. Fourth Eon. As the Glob kept on exploring the strange world, he found that he liked some fruits, and he didn't like others. He discovered that he had a good feeling about some animals, and he felt better when he was far away from others. If the sky was gray and cloudy, he didn't like it. But if it was blue and the sun was shining, he thought it was wonderful. Up to this time, the Glob had never uttered a word. He merely thought about the trees and animals he saw in his wanderings. Now he began to make sounds when he liked something, and other sounds when he didn't. When he liked something, he would say, "Ugh." If he liked it very much, he would say, "Glug." If he didn't like it, he would say, "Pooh." If he disliked it very much, he would say, "Pooh-pooh." Gradually he developed other words that meant he was hungry, or sleepy, or tired. There wasn't anybody to talk to, but the Glob got some comfort out of talking to himself. If he found some particularly delicious fruit, for example, he would eat it and then smile and say, "Glug." He knew the fruit was good, but it gave him added satisfaction to say it. He invented lots of words, and as he walked along, he would always comment on the passing scene. Once he was walking toward the home tree after another one of those really good days. He had found some sweet, juicy berries on a bush, and he had almost caught a small furry animal. The weather was cool but sunny, and he felt just about as fine as a Glob could feel. As he walked, he began talking. Instead of saying just one word, he said several words in a row. To make them sound better, he stretched them out in the key of C. He didn't know it was the key of C, but that is what it was. It sounded like this: Uggity-gluggity moon, uggity-gluggity June. For some reason this sounded excellent to the Glob. He chanted it over and over again. As he walked, he found it was possible to keep his steps in time to the chanting. This was even more fun. It wasn't very long until he was marching along the trail, keeping perfect time as he chanted the words in a row. 1, 2, 1, 2. Uggity-gluggity moon, uggity-gluggity June, uggity-gluggity moon, uggity-gluggity June. He went uggity-gluggity moon all the way to his tree. When he got there, he didn't climb the tree as he usually did. Instead, he marched around and around it. As he marched, he kept time to his little verse. There was absolutely no way for him to know it, but he was doing something extremely important. The Glob was singing the world's first song. Uggity-gluggity moon, uggity-gluggity June. Fifth Eon. The Glob arose the next morning with a song on his lips. Of course, it was the same little song. It had to be, because it was the only one he knew. He climbed down his tree and he started hunting breakfast in a gay mood. In fact, this was the beginning of a very pleasant time for him. For 1.5 million years he was a happy Glob. All sorts of good experiences befell him, but the best of all was when he got the pip. During his trips away from the home tree, the Glob noticed that as time rolled by, there were many changes taking place in the world. The trees and plants were not the same. Instead of a few big fat leaves, most of the trees now had lots of small ones. Some of the plants had pretty flowers. The fruit was smaller, but it tasted much better. As the changes took place, the Glob watched them and decided the world was taking a turn for the better. To be exact, he decided that it was a good world after all. The big swamp where he used to go to watch the dinosaurs that ate all the time had dried up. Now there was just a wide valley there with a stream winding through it. The big dinosaurs were gone because there were not enough plants for them to eat. In their place were other animals of many kinds. There were big ones and small ones, but none of them was as big as the dinosaurs with the enormous middles. Some of the creatures in the changing world had feathers, and when the Glob drew near them, they rose in the air and flapped away. The Glob watched them and wished that he could fly in the air. There were some animals like elephants, but they had stubby trunks. There were others that were small and furry, but they could run much faster than the Glob. When he surprised them, they raised their tails in the air and dashed off across the landscape. When they did, the Glob was disappointed, because he wanted to play with them. In all the millions of years since he had come out of the early sea, he had never had anything to play with. Why do they have to hightail it away, he thought. One day the Glob was caught in the rain when he was far from home, and it kept pouring down. For a long time he sat under a tree while the storm raged around him. When the skies cleared, he started for his tree, shivering and feeling very uncomfortable. He was making his way along a stream which had overflowed its banks, when he came upon some kind of a den that had been washed out by the floodwaters. Near the den was a small animal. It had large ears and a tail with a tuft at the end. The animal was covered with brown hair. It didn't move, but just lay still in the mud. He examined it closely, studying its muddy paws and black nose. Then he reached out one hand and touched its soft hair. When he did, the animal made a sound. It said, "Pip." The Glob touched it again, and again it said, "Pip." He rubbed its back, and it said, "Pip, pip." The Glob smiled one of his smiles, bent over the little animal, and said, "Pip." Then he picked it up and held it in his arms. He noticed that it felt warm as he brushed the mud from its coat. He held it close to him, and finally it opened its eyes. When it did, it said, "Pip." It was getting late, so the Glob started for home, carrying the little animal. On the way he found a bird's nest that had been washed out by the storm. There were some cracked eggs in it, so he put the animal down and gave it the eggs. It ate them and said, "Pip, pip." The Glob carried the animal home, and when he reached the tree he went up to the nest, holding the animal in one arm and climbing with the other arm and his legs. That night the Glob and the little animal slept curled up together. The next morning the Glob carried the animal back down the tree and put it on the ground. The Glob petted it a while and then walked away a few feet, turned and said, "Pip." The animal sat looking at him. The Glob said, "Pip," again, and started away. This time the animal followed him, trotting close at his heels. From that time on, the Glob and the little animal were always together. The animal would catch small creatures to eat. When they were not hunting for food, the two of them would romp. After millions of years, the Glob discovered that it was better not to romp alone. For want of something better, he called his little animal Pip. When he called, "Pip," it would come running to him. There have been many changes in the world since then, and today that Pip would be a pup. It was the world's first pup. Sixth Eon. It was wonderful to have the Pip, but having him caused certain problems. In the first place, the Pip began to grow. His voice changed and became a lusty bark. He put on so much weight that it was all the Glob could do to lug him up the tree. Often they would no sooner get settled in the nest than the Pip would start barking to go down again. Then the poor Glob would have to make another trip. It was exasperating, but the Glob put up with it because he had grown to love his Pip. This was not the only trouble. The home tree had seen its best days. It was the last of the trees with the big leaves anywhere around. Now it was beginning to go. It didn't have as many leaves as it used to have, and more were turning brown. Some of the limbs had rotted away. Instead of a nice roof of leaves over the nest, there was a gaping hole where the rain came in. This made it hard to sleep on rainy nights. The old home tree was a shambles. More limbs kept falling down, and more leaves kept drifting to the ground. The Glob was faced with a housing problem. With everything coming down that way, he decided it was time for him to get a new home. Hoisting the Pip on his shoulders, he climbed down and started house hunting. With the Pip at his heels, he hunted all day. Finally, he found just what he was looking for, a very fine piece of early real estate. It was a cave. It was in a cliff that rose at one side of a beautiful valley. It had a southern exposure and a splendid view. There was running water in a spring not far away. The entrance was somewhat wide, but the Glob decided he could pile up some stones and make it smaller. With all these features in mind, the Glob decided to take it. That night he hoisted the Pip up the old tree for the last time. The next day they moved. The moving wasn't much of a job, because all the Glob had in the world beside the Pip were a few bright feathers he had found, and a stick. But there was lots to do in the new home. First the Glob cleaned it out, carrying away some old bones which were lying around on the floor. Next he went down into the valley and he pulled a lot of fresh leaves. With these he made a bed for himself and the Pip. Finally he carried stones and piled them up to make the doorway smaller. He worked a long time, but at last the door was just big enough for him to squeeze through. When he was finished, they called the Pip, and went out and sat on a large stone. Sitting there, they looked over their new home. "Glug, Pip," he said. The words were no sooner out of his mouth than the Pip began to growl, and the hair stood up on his back. The Glob thought this was a strange way to act about such a fine home, but he saw that the Pip's ears were sticking straight up, and he was staring down the valley. The Glob was just turning to look when they heard a mighty roar. Charging toward them was the most awesome animal the Glob had seen since he met the great dinosaur. It was like an enormous cat. It was striped, and it had a long tail. It had big claws, but the most fearsome part of it was its mouth. This mouth was wide open, and from it 2 enormous curved and pointed teeth stuck out. It was a saber-toothed tiger. The Glob and the Pip lost no time dashing for home. They ran up the hillside like the wind and scurried into their cave. Right on their heels was Saber-Tooth. He slid to a stop at the door, and he let out a roar that shook the walls of the cave. But he was too big to squeeze through the door. He reached in with one paw, and the Glob and the Pip shivered to see those claws so close. But they were safe. The tiger couldn't reach them. The Glob sank down on the bed in relief. "Phew," he said, and he looked at the small door of his cave. "Just in time," he thought. Then he put his arm around the Pip, and the 2 of them sat listening to the roars of the tiger outside the door. Even though they were safe, they trembled a little at each roar. 7th Eon. The comfort and safety of his new home gave the Glob more time for hunting. He and the Pip would wander far and wide, because they knew that the comfortable cave would be waiting for them when they got back. When they were not roaming the valleys and forests, the Glob would sit around the cave, trying to invent useful articles. This was very difficult, because nothing had ever been invented before. He had to start from scratch. He collected sticks and stones and pieces of strong vine, and took them into his cave. There he would sit all day, arranging them and tying them together. For a good many centuries they would just fall apart when he tried to tie them together. But gradually he became a better craftsman. At length he found a stone that was shaped just right. With a long piece of vine, he tied it securely to the end of a stout stick. He waved it in the air, and the Pip shrank back in terror. There in the shadows of the cave the Glob had made the first club. It gave him a feeling of power, and he walked up and down the cave, brandishing his club in menacing fashion. It was hard for the Pip to understand this, but he soon realized that the Glob was only playing when he shook the club at him. From that time on, the Glob carried the club wherever he went. He found it was a useful invention. He learned that he could throw it up into the air and knock fruit off of branches without having to climb the tree. This saved time. As a matter of fact, it was the first bit of time that had ever been saved. One day the Glob was walking down the valley when he heard a growl. Coming toward him was a half-grown leopard. It bared its teeth as it snarled and showed every intention of eating the Glob. The Pip growled back and the hair stood up on his neck. The Glob was scared, but as the leopard charged at him, he threw his club with all his might. He was turning to dash for the cave when he saw the club strike the leopard on the head. The beast fell to the ground and lay still. The Glob waited a long time, and when the leopard didn't move any more, he went up to inspect it. It was dead. The Glob rubbed his hands over it and felt its soft fur. He sat looking at it a long time, his brow wrinkled in thought. Suddenly his face lit up. He hoisted the leopard onto his shoulder and carried it home to the cave. The climate had been changing gradually, and the Glob and the Pip had found that the nights were getting chilly, even in the cave. The leopard's warm fur had given the Glob an idea. If this leopard can wear this soft fur, well, then why can't I? He thought. Taking a sharp stone which he had used to scrape sticks, he skinned the leopard. Then he hung the skin outside the cave to dry. When it was dry, he tied the corners together with pieces of vine. He pulled it over his head, and he stood up straight. The Pip growled and backed up against the wall. It took a while for the Glob to convince the Pip that he was not a leopard, but just the same old Glob in leopard skin. When the Pip was convinced, the Glob picked up his club and went outside, where he strutted up and down with his nose in the air. He was very proud, and acted as if he were showing what the well-dressed Glob should wear. He had a right to be proud, for he was wearing the world's first clothes. The leopard skin was stiff, and it stuck out at curious angles, but it was warm. The Glob adjusted it and strutted some more. It was only a few hundred years after designing his leopard suit that the Glob found a better way of keeping warm. He was sleeping soundly in the cave one night when he was awakened by a terrific thunderstorm. He arose from his bed and he stood in the doorway. The Glob had never seen such a storm. Bolt after bolt of lightning crashed over the hills and lit up the valley as bright as day. He was watching the storm when there was a great flash. He could see a streak of lightning come down out of the sky and crash into the forest that covered the hillside directly across the valley from his cave. It was the biggest flash of lightning the Glob had ever seen. When the storm was over, he crawled back into his bed and he snuggled up close to the Pip. The Pip had shown no interest in the storm, but had remained curled up in the leaves. The next day dawned bright and clear. The Glob decided on another hunting trip, but just as he stepped out of the door of the cave, he noticed clouds of smoke rising from the forest across the valley. It seemed to come from about where he had seen the great flash of lightning. He set out on his way, crossed the stream, and entered the forest. He had walked a while when he heard a roaring and a snapping and a crackling. Approaching cautiously, he got nearer and nearer the sound. Suddenly he saw bright yellow flames dancing among the trees. Dark smoke billowed up and floated away in the sky. As he drew near, he began to feel warmer, and when he got quite near the fire, it was so hot he could hardly stand it. Getting as close as he could, he watched, fascinated, as the flames consumed vines, leaves, and whole trees. As the fire moved on, he followed, but suddenly he leaped into the air with a yell. He had stepped on a hot coal. He passed the whole day investigating the fire. He picked up limbs which were burning on one end and threw them into the air, watching the flames brighten as they soared. He soon learned that if he played with the fire, he was apt to get burned. Tired of throwing the burning sticks in the air, he sat down on the ground and watched the burning forest. It was late afternoon when he had the greatest idea he had had up to that time. It was so exciting that he trembled at the thought. "Why can't I keep some of that fire in my cave?" he thought. He gathered a bundle of sticks and twigs and held them in one arm. Next he approached the fire and picked up a limb that was burning at one end. Carrying the sticks and holding the burning limb aloft, he ran down the hillside, splashed through the shallow stream, and ran up to his cave. Once inside, he put down the burning limb and piled his armful of sticks on top of it. To his delight, they burned brightly. He was so fascinated by his fire that he didn't notice a spark that flew from it into his bed of dry leaves. Before he realized what was happening, his bed burst into flames. It burned so brightly and got so hot that the Glob and the Pip had to run out of the cave. It was far too hot to stay inside. This taught the Glob a lesson. He gathered more leaves to make a new bed, but he was careful to keep his bed and his fire at opposite ends of the cave. He also learned that by putting only a few sticks at a time on the fire, he could keep it small and not too hot. That night, the Glob and the Pip stayed up very late. They sat staring into the fire. As he stared, the Glob imagined he could see leopards and caves and trees in the dancing flames. 8th Eon. The Glob found that having the fire made his cave a lot more comfortable. He learned to keep a pile of dry sticks on hand, so he wouldn't have to run outside every time he wanted to fix the fire. There's nothing like modern conveniences in the home, he thought. One evening he happened to rub a burned stick against the wall of the cave, and he noticed that it left a mark. He rubbed it on the wall again, and it made another mark. It was fun, and he sat up late, doodling with his charred stick. By the time he went to bed, there were lots of marks, but they were all pretty silly. They didn't seem to make any sense. Doodling became one of the Glob's pastimes. He had been doodling for years when one day he thought he might arrange the marks so they would look like something real instead of just foolishness. He decided to try and make a deer that he had seen in the forest. He stirred up the fire so it burned brightly and set to work. In the flickering light of the cave he worked all night. It was almost daybreak when he went to bed, but on the wall was a picture of a deer. The Glob was too tired and sleepy to realize he had drawn the world's first picture. It wasn't such a fine drawing, but at that it was as good as a lot of the drawings that people are making nowadays. Having drawn the Earth's first picture, the Glob became an artist. He spent most of his spare time drawing. In time, the walls of his cave were covered with pictures, but still the Glob didn't stop. He drew new pictures right over the old ones. For centuries it seemed that he was never going to do anything but draw pictures. But one day something happened that changed his mind. He had been drawing for so long that the smoke from the fire bothered his eyes, so he decided to stop for a while and take a walk. He and the Pip were strolling down the valley, thinking of nothing in particular. They were going around a huge boulder that stood near the stream when the Glob got a terrible shock. Standing only 15 feet away from him was another Glob. It resembled him a great deal and was just about the same size, but it didn't have on a leopard skin suit. It was wearing just what the Glob used to wear before his discovery, which was nothing at all. The two stood looking at each other in amazement. The Glob thought it would be nice to exchange a few words, so he said, "Glug." Just as he said it, the Pip ran toward the stranger. The strange Glob, apparently thinking the Pip was going to bite him, hauled off and kicked the Pip in the ribs. The Pip howled. The Glob walked up to the stranger and said some words which meant, "Quit kicking my dog around." Before you could say dinosaur, they were having a big fight. The Glob was trying to hit the stranger with his club, and the stranger was flailing away with his fists. They were hard at it when right near them sounded a terrible roar. It was a saber-tooth. He had been attracted by the noise of the fighting and decided it was a good chance to get some globs for supper. But he had roared too soon. When the Glob and the stranger heard that awful sound, they stopped fighting and each ran off in the opposite direction. Saber-tooth hesitated a moment, trying to decide which Glob to chase. His pause gave them time to speed away to safety. As usual in times of danger, the Glob ran for his cave, with the Pip close at his heels. Once inside, he stirred up the fire and he sat down beside it to think about what had happened. He wondered what the strange Glob was really like. He thought it would be nice if they could talk and play instead of fighting. He grew very sad as he thought about it. Tears dropped from his eyes as he shook his head, and he said, "Why can't we be friends?" That has been said a great many times since, but the Glob, of course, said it for the very first time. Incidentally, the Glob was both sad and funny as he stared into the fire so solemnly. During the fight he had been hit in one eye, and now there was a black circle all around it. He had no mirror with which to look at himself, so he had no way of telling that his face was decorated with the world's first black eye. What a shiner! The poor Glob. Ninth Eon. Deciding that he would make friends with the stranger if he possibly could, the Glob set out the next day to hunt for him. He went to the big boulder where they had had the fight, but he was not there. All day long he wandered along the stream and through the forest, but there was no sign of the stranger. Finally, the Glob was walking through a grove of trees when in the distance he thought he caught a glimpse of him. He walked through the trees slowly, but when he drew near, he found to his astonishment that it was not the stranger he had seen the day before, but another one. "Oh," he thought, "if it's not one Glob, it's another." Not wanting to start another fight, he picked up the Pip and held him under his arm. Then he walked forward, his other arm raised in a friendly salute. "Glug," said the Glob. The stranger smiled a smile, and the Glob smiled one back at him. The stranger approached, reached out his hand, and felt the Glob's leopard skin suit. He examined the Glob and then looked at the Pip. The Glob petted the Pip, and then held him out for the stranger to pet. The stranger was petting the Pip's head when they heard a cough. Turning, they saw the other stranger, the one the Glob had had the fight with. He had been watching them while they were busy making friends. When he saw that the Pip and his master were friendly, he too came forward and smiled. The Glob put the Pip on the ground, and the two strangers played with him for a long time. To the Glob, who watched them closely, it was plain that they had never had a Pip to play with before. He threw a stick to show them how the Pip would chase it, and all three of them laughed together. This was the beginning of a wonderful friendship between the Glob and the strangers. He named them Gog and Mog. Motioning them to follow him, he led them up the valley and showed them his cave. He stirred up his fire, and he was pleased at their astonishment as they stood in its warm glow. He showed them his pictures on the walls, and he let them drink some of the water from his spring. After they had marveled at the cave for a long time, they walked to the door and motioned for the Glob to follow them. They crossed the stream and led the way deep into the forest. They had traveled for several hours when they came to a grove of big trees with gnarled branches. Under the trees were a lot of Globs. All of them resembled his two friends, but they were not all the same size. Some were larger than others, and some were very small. They all crowded around the Glob and stared and stared. They made strange sounds as they touched his leopard skin suit and admired his club. At first they drew back when the Pip came up to them, but like Gog and Mog, they soon learned that the Pip was friendly and wouldn't bite. Gog and Mog showed the Glob around the grove. They lived in nests made of twigs and leaves up in the gnarled trees, just as the Glob had done so long before. In fact, it had been so long since he had lived in the tree that he had forgotten it. He watched these Globs as they ate leaves and berries. "These poor things don't know how to live," he thought. "I must take them all up to my cave and show them the advantages of modern inventions." That is just what he did. He got the whole group, there were 20 or more of them, to follow him, and he showed them his home and his inventions. When they saw how much better it was to live in a cave, they all left their nests in the forest and found caves for themselves in the rocky walls along the valley. Gog and Mog found themselves caves right near where the Glob lived. The others found caves not far away. The lonely valley became a thriving community. It was a busy place with big Globs and little Globs coming and going all the time. In fact, it was the world's first town. The Glob was everywhere. He taught them to make clubs, and he took them on hunting trips. He showed them how to skin leopards and other animals and make suits of clothes out of them. He taught them all he knew about taking care of a fire, and in the evening he would visit around all the other caves to give lessons in how to draw pictures. He certainly was a busy Glob. But best of all, the Glob taught them the words he had invented. He would sit by the fire in the morning, slowly saying the words and making signs to show what they meant. They developed more and more words until they had quite a language and could say almost anything they felt like saying. This made the Glob very happy. One night some guests had just left, and he was sitting alone by his fire. He reached out and idly scratched the pip's ear. Gee, thought the Glob, it's wonderful to have other Globs to talk to. 10th Eon. For a long time the Glob was perfectly happy. Other families came out of the forest and moved into caves along the stream. The Glob was always glad to show them his inventions and help teach them the language. Young Globs played along the stream, and on warm evenings the grown-up Globs would sit out in the moonlight and sing the song that the Glob had taught them. But gradually there came a change. They found that they had to go further and further to get wood for their fires. It became so bad that some of them had to spend most of their time searching for wood. Hunting also got worse. They had hunted in the region so long that animals were getting scarce. There were very few left to kill for food or to make new suits. The Glob thought about it hard and long. He knew they just couldn't live under those conditions. He knew he had to think of something, because all the other Globs loved him and trusted him. They knew he would figure out what to do. Hadn't he invented leopard suits and clubs? The Glob thought and thought. The situation around town was pretty bad when one day a great idea came to him. He called all the Globs to a special meeting. It was, in fact, the first meeting ever held. They met under a great tree that had become a sort of gathering place. The Glob climbed up on a boulder. The rest of them formed a semicircle in front of him, some sitting on the ground, others standing and leaning on their clubs. The Glob looked at the upturned faces, cleared his throat, and started to speak. Translated into present-day language, it would be like this. Fellow Globs, neighbors, and friends, we are met here this afternoon for a most important purpose. Our happiness, our very livelihood are at stake. As you all know, we have lived here so long that we have gathered all the firewood for a long distance around our valley. Now we have to go so far that we can keep only the smallest of fires. Soon we will have no fires at all. And furthermore, the hunting has become so bad that in time we will have neither meat to eat nor clothes to wear. When that happens, we will be right back where we started so many eons ago. Therefore, my friends, I propose that instead of going backward, we go forward. I make the motion that we pack up our belongings and follow the trail that leads away from this valley until we find a place where we can have a better way of life. What is the sentiment of this meeting? As the Glob ended the world's first speech, the crowd broke into loud cheers. Some threw their clubs in the air, and others pushed forward to congratulate the Glob on his great plan. They told him that they knew all the time that he would find some way out of the fix they were in. The next several days were busy ones in the valley as they all prepared for the long journey. They made extra clubs, and they repaired their leopard-skin suits as best they could. They arranged a flat stone across two poles so they could take along some of their precious fire. They collected all the food they could find and wrapped it in bundles. At last they were all packed. The day of the start dawned bright and clear. As the sun was rising, they all came out of their caves, carrying their bundles and their clubs. They gathered beneath the meeting tree to make sure they hadn't forgotten anything. They took a last look at their valley, and some were sad to leave. But they knew they were headed for a better life. The Glob took the lead with the pip at his heels. Then came Gog and Mog. Then came the rest of the Globs, each one carrying everything he owned. The column climbed slowly to the top of the hill and started down the trail on the other side. As they walked, they had absolutely no way of knowing that they were the first men and that they were starting down the long road through the ages that led to civilization. They had a long way to go, and there were lots of troubles ahead, But as they looked down the trail they didn't seem to be afraid. As a matter of fact, as they trudged along, the Glob raised his voice and they all joined in singing their little song. Uggity gluggity moon, uggity gluggity June.